Behind the walls of a compound in occupied China, the Imperial Japanese Army built a factory, not for weapons or ammunition. This factory was designed to produce one thing: death itself. Thousands of men, women, and children entered this place alive. Not one was meant to leave. They were called logs, stripped of their names, their dignity, and ultimately their lives. This is the story of Unit 731, the most horrific state-sponsored program of human experimentation the world has ever known, and the cover-up that followed it. Before we go further into this dark chapter of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss what comes next in this story. 1931. The Japanese Empire invades Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. It was a land grab, rich in resources and strategic position. Among the officers stationed there was a military physician named Shiro Ishii, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly without moral constraint. He had a vision: biological warfare on an industrial scale. Ishii had toured biological research facilities across Europe in the early 1930s. He returned convinced that germ warfare was the future of military power: cheap, devastating, untraceable. He lobbied Japan's military leaders relentlessly. His argument was simple: the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned biological weapons. Therefore, other nations must already be developing them secretly. The army approved his plan. In 1937, Unit 731 was formally established near the city of Harbin in Manchuria. Its official name was deliberately mundane and misleading. Its cover name hid something monstrous. The Pingfang complex covered 6 square kilometers. It contained laboratories, living quarters, an airfield, a railway connection, and a crematorium. It was a self-contained city dedicated entirely to death. At its peak, Unit 731 employed over 3,000 scientists, doctors, and support staff. These were trained medical professionals, men who had sworn oaths to preserve human life. The prisoners were drawn from occupied populations: Chinese civilians, Korean forced laborers, captured Soviet soldiers, and suspected resistance fighters. Men, women, and even children were taken. Inside the compound, prisoners were never called by their names. They were referred to as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, lumber to be used and discarded without conscience. The experiments began immediately. Ishii's team focused on developing the most lethal biological agents known to science: plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis among them. Prisoners were deliberately infected with deadly diseases. Scientists then observed how the infections progressed through each stage, documenting symptoms, organ failure, and time until death with clinical precision. Vivisections were performed on living subjects without any anesthesia. The rationale was coldly scientific. Anesthetics might alter the results. The suffering of the subjects was simply irrelevant to them. These procedures were not the work of rogue individuals. They were systematic, documented, and approved through the chain of command. Unit 731 operated with the full authority of Imperial Japan. Frostbite experiments were conducted during the brutal Manchurian winters. Prisoners' limbs were exposed to sub-zero temperatures, then subjected to various rewarming methods while researchers recorded the tissue damage. Pressure chamber experiments tested how the human body responded to rapid decompression. Subjects were sealed inside chambers where air pressure was increased or decreased until their bodies could no longer endure. Other experiments involved depriving subjects of food and water to document the stages of starvation and dehydration. Some were injected with seawater to test if it could substitute for saline solution. Weapons testing was integral to the program. Prisoners were tied to stakes at measured distances from explosive devices to study fragmentation patterns and blast injuries on living human bodies. But Ishii's ultimate goal was never just research. He wanted to create a deployable biological weapon, something that could devastate enemy populations far behind the front lines of battle. His team developed a delivery system: ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas. The ceramic casing would shatter on impact without generating the heat that would kill the fleas inside. In 1940, Unit 731 launched its first known biological attack. Aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over the Chinese city of Ningbo. Within weeks, an epidemic erupted across the region. In 1941, the city of Chengde was targeted. Grain and cloth contaminated with plague-carrying fleas were dropped from aircraft. Bubonic plague spread rapidly through the civilian population below. The death toll from these biological attacks is difficult to calculate with certainty. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Chinese civilians died from deliberately released plague, cholera, and other pathogens. Unit 731 also contaminated water supplies and food sources in Chinese villages. Wells were poisoned with typhoid and cholera. The resulting epidemics were designed to look like natural outbreaks. Back at Pingfang, the experiments continued without pause. Researchers rotated through assignments. New subjects were brought in as others perished. The compound operated like a conveyor belt of systematic cruelty. Survivors later testified that some researchers showed no emotion whatsoever. They performed their work as though the subjects on their tables were truly nothing more than logs, inanimate material. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan, the program only intensified. Ishii pushed for larger-scale biological attacks. Plans were drawn up to strike American forces directly with biological agents. One proposed operation, codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night, called for kamikaze pilots to crash plague-infected aircraft into San Diego, California. The war ended before it could be carried out. August 1945, the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan and invades Manchuria. The end comes with terrifying speed for the Japanese Empire. At Pingfang, Ishii moved fast. He ordered the immediate destruction of all evidence, every document, every specimen, every piece of equipment that could prove what had happened inside those walls. The remaining prisoners, the living subjects still held within the compound, were executed. Ishii's final order ensured there would be no survivors left to testify about what they had endured. Buildings were dynamited. Laboratories were burned. Animals carrying experimental diseases were released into the countryside, causing yet another wave of plague outbreaks among the local Chinese population. Ishii and his senior staff fled south, escaping before Soviet forces reached the facility. They carried with them the most critical research data, hidden in personal luggage and smuggled back to Japan. When the Soviets arrived at Pingfang, they found a demolished ruin, but the destruction was not complete. Enough evidence remained, along with captured lower-ranking personnel, to piece together the truth. Meanwhile, American intelligence was also closing in. U.S. forces had captured Ishii and several key researchers. What happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions of the post-war era. Ishii and his researchers were interrogated extensively by American military intelligence. They offered a deal, complete cooperation, and all of their biological warfare research data in exchange for immunity. The request went up the chain of command. It reached General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in occupied Japan. MacArthur saw strategic value and approved the deal. The reasoning was documented in declassified files. The deal was struck in secret. Unit 731's researchers handed over thousands of pages of experimental data obtained through the torture and murder of thousands of human beings. In exchange, Ishii and every researcher under his command received full immunity from war crimes prosecution. Not a single member of Unit 731 was ever tried by an American court. The Soviets, however, took a different path. In December 1949, they held the Khabarovsk war crime trials, prosecuting 12 captured members of Unit 731 for their biological warfare crimes. The defendants confessed to developing biological weapons and conducting human experiments. They described the operations in chilling detail. All 12 were convicted and sentenced to labor camp terms. The West dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as Soviet propaganda. American and British governments publicly denied that Unit 731 had ever existed. The cover-up was now operating at the highest levels. Ishii returned to civilian life in Japan. He was never arrested, never charged, never held accountable. He practiced medicine privately and reportedly converted to Christianity before his death in 1959. Many of his former researchers went on to have distinguished careers. They became university professors, pharmaceutical executives, and leaders of Japan's post-war public health system. Their pasts were erased completely. For decades, the Japanese government maintained a policy of silence. Official records were classified or destroyed. Textbooks made no mention of Unit 731. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that the truth began to surface. Investigative journalists, historians, and surviving witnesses started breaking through decades of institutionalized denial and secrecy. Historian Sheldon Harris spent years uncovering the truth. In 1995, historian Hal Gold published Unit 731 Testimony, a collection of first-hand accounts from former staff members who broke their silence after half a century of secrecy. Declassified American documents confirmed the immunity deal. National Archives releases in the late 1990s revealed the full scope of the arrangement between U.S. intelligence and Japan's biological warfare researchers. Families of Chinese victims began filing lawsuits in Japanese courts during the 1990s. They demanded official acknowledgement and compensation for the suffering their relatives had endured at Pingfang. In 2002, a Tokyo district court ruled on a landmark case. The judges acknowledged that the experiments had occurred and that Unit 731 had conducted biological warfare against Chinese civilians, but the court's final decision was devastating. The court confirmed the atrocities but denied all compensation. The victims' families received official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been tortured and killed, but nothing more than words. The legacy of Unit 731 remains an open wound in East Asian relations. China and Korea continue to demand fuller accountability. Japan's responses have been inconsistent and frequently inadequate. In 2018, Japan's National Archives released a nearly complete list of Unit 731 members for the first time, over 3,000 names that had been kept secret for decades. The estimated death toll from Unit 731's direct experiments ranges from 3,000 to 12,000 victims. The true number may never be known. Ishii's destruction of records saw to that. When biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities are included, the death toll rises dramatically. Some historians estimate that the total number of casualties caused by Unit 731 exceeds 200,000. The American Biological Weapons Program at Fort Detrick, Maryland directly benefited from Unit 731's research data. The knowledge gained through human suffering was quietly integrated into Cold War defense programs. This raises the most uncomfortable question of all. By granting immunity, the United States made a calculated decision. That strategic advantage in the Cold War was worth more than justice for thousands. Ironically, American scientists later concluded that much of Unit 731's data was of limited scientific value. The experiments were so poorly controlled that the results were often unreliable and unusable. Thousands had died in agony. Their suffering had been traded for data that proved largely worthless. The deal that bought silence and buried justice had not even delivered on its strategic promise. Today, the site of the Pingfang complex houses the Unit 731 Museum, a memorial and research center operated by the Chinese government to preserve the historical record of what occurred. Inside the museum, artifacts recovered from the ruins are displayed alongside testimony from survivors of the biological attacks. Photographs, documents, and laboratory equipment tell a story that can never be unseen. The compound near Harbin was massive, over 6 square kilometers of laboratories, dormitories, holding cells, and cremation facilities. From the outside, it appeared to be a legitimate water purification research center. Inside, it was something else entirely. Ishii recruited top graduates from Japan's finest medical universities. He offered generous research funding, military rank, and the promise of scientific breakthroughs. Many researchers arrived believing they would conduct legitimate epidemic prevention work. The prisoners, called maruta, meaning logs of wood, were Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Russian civilians and prisoners of war. They were given numbers instead of names. They were treated as research material, not human beings. Frostbite experiments were conducted outdoors in Manchurian winter. Subjects' limbs were exposed to sub-zero temperatures for hours. Researchers documented tissue damage progression in clinical detail. The data was considered scientifically valuable by the Japanese military. Unit 731 also developed biological weapons for field deployment. Plague-infected fleas were bred in massive quantities and released over Chinese cities including Changde and Ningbo. Cholera bacteria were introduced into water supplies. The Changde biological weapon attack of 1941 caused a plague outbreak that killed an estimated tens of thousands of Chinese civilians. Unit 731 documented the results as field test data for their weapons program. As the war ended in August 1945, Ishii ordered the complete destruction of all evidence. Buildings were demolished, records burned, remaining prisoners were killed, staff were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. But Ishii had an insurance policy. He had preserved key research data separately: biological warfare findings, pathogen cultivation methods, human experiment results. He offered this data to the United States in exchange for immunity from prosecution. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied powers in occupied Japan, approved the immunity deal. The United States determined that the biological warfare data was too valuable to lose to Soviet intelligence during the emerging Cold War. Ishii and his researchers were never prosecuted by the United States or its allies. Many returned to civilian life in Japan and held prominent positions in medicine, academia, and the pharmaceutical industry for decades after the war. The only trial of Unit 731 members was conducted by the Soviet Union. The Khabarovsk war crime trials of 1949 convicted 12 former members. The Western Allies dismissed the trial as Soviet propaganda. Shiro Ishii died on October 9, 1959, at the age of 67. He was never charged with any crime. He lived his final years in Tokyo as a free man. The architect of Unit 731 faced no justice. Declassified U.S. documents released in the 1990s confirmed the immunity deal. The American government had traded justice for data. The biological warfare research obtained from Unit 731 was classified for over 50 years. The Japanese government did not formally acknowledge Unit 731's human experimentation activities until court proceedings in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The acknowledgement came decades after the evidence was public. Chinese and Korean victims' families filed lawsuits seeking compensation. Japanese courts acknowledged that the experiments occurred but denied financial compensation. The legal battles continued into the 2020s. Justice remains incomplete. Today, the former site of Unit 731 near Harbin is a museum and memorial. Chinese visitors walk through the remains of laboratories and holding cells. The physical evidence that could not be completely destroyed tells its own story. Unit 731 stands as a permanent reminder. When governments place military ambition above human dignity, when science abandons ethics, the result is not progress, it is atrocity on an industrial scale. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the like button and bell icon. Sharing these histories ensures they are never forgotten. The victims of Unit 731 deserve to be remembered.